Welcome back, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about tides and basically how to read a tide table and use that information to better assist yourself to catch more fish when you're out on the water fishing. So basically how to find the fish during incoming tides, where do the fish go during outgoing tides, physically what part of the tide table should we be focusing on when we're doing certain types of fishing, and kind of just use the information that we see on these charts to help us catch more fish in the real world when we're out on the water. So let's dive straight into this and go ahead and start with the basic stuff. Kind of just want to get a basic warm up. I'm sorry for those of you who already know what a tide chart looks like, but let's get a brief warm up here. So this is a tide chart. This specific cutout that you guys are looking at is a random area, random location. It's strictly just an example. Use this information to better target your area with your own tides. So right now, what we are looking at is a blue curvy line. So what is this blue curvy line? Simply put, this is basically indications of different water heights throughout a period of time. So here we have November 7th all the way to the 14th. So this is a week time frame we're looking at. So right here at the peak of this tide, we can see this is the peak of the incoming. So basically peak high tide, the highest water level during this period of time would be right here where the cursor is currently hovering. So down here would be the peak low tide. So this is the lowest the water will be in this time frame during this specific tide. So as you can see, this kind of just replicates over a week. Obviously this is just kind of like a carbon copy, cookie cutter example. Tides never really look so perfect. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Here in Florida on the West Coast, they look very out of whack. And then on the Atlantic east side, they're actually pretty predictable and pretty organized and kind of look relatively similar in 6-hour increments. So everywhere you are, the tides are completely different. So let's get back into this chart right here and talk a little bit about what we're looking at. So right here on this side would be the incoming tide. So the reason we call it incoming is basically because water is making its way from its lowest point to its highest point. So basically this is an upward trend of water that is moving up to the highest point. So this is basically just a physical 2D rendering showing you water moving all the way up to its highest point and then showing you water move down to its lowest point. So when we see these curves, the first thing we can know is the water is probably moving slowest right here, and the water is probably moving slowest right here, 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 and so on. At every single peak, it looks like that is probably where the water is moving slowest. Why do we say that? So basically, right here is, number one, it's kind of like it's showing you a little bit of a level out, a flat, water's not really doing anything, it's kind of plateaued in each of these little peaks right here. This is what we call slack tide. So this area right here where it's kind of slowing down would be our slack tide. Right here would also be that slack tide. Our more steep areas right here, like this steep part of the incoming tide, would be arguably one of the faster water movements in our tide. So right here, we have a very steep little curve. It is safe to say that the closer we get to this little kind of plateau, the slower the water will move. So when we're thinking about water movement, we're thinking about baits flushing either in or out. So you can get high water movement on each side, just in different directions, doing different things. So for example, on an outgoing tide, what is happening? Mostly water, bait, crustaceans, fiddler crabs, all sorts of stuff is getting flushed out of mangroves, flushed out of estuaries, and kind of pumped back into the bay, into deeper parts, pockets, and deeper channels and water areas where the fish might be allocated into that body of water. What's happening in an incoming tide is the reverse. So you have nutrients, fish, pilchards, all sorts of stuff coming from the bay, crustaceans, blue crabs, and then getting flushed into the mangroves and pushing way back. So when you see those videos of people on Instagram or YouTube and they're flipping at mangroves and just giant snook is popping up on it, the best time to do that is probably in this incoming tide period right here, where the water is at its highest level. So when the water is all the way up, what happens is fish are able to push back more, and we are able to target areas that we couldn't otherwise if that water was not there. So number one, incoming tide at the peak is very good for flipping at docks, flipping at mangroves, targeting snook, targeting redfish, even putting like some cut baits in the mangroves for some redfish. I know a lot of you guys like to do that in Tampa Bay. So that's another great thing you can do during this part of the tide. Also, what else can we do? We can get on the flats. So when we think about poling the flats for redfish, poling the flats for whatever it is, or even just cruising the flats to see what we can find, we need water to be up there, right? So typically the peak of the incoming tide, that peak up there is the best time to get and cruise over, because a lot of these fish, not only do we need water to get onto the flats, but these fish are also looking for nutrients, crabs and stuff that is usually elevated out during the low tide. So now water floods over and kind of opens the floodgates for these fish to explore new areas and feed. So when you see those tailing bonefish, tailing in reds, a lot of times that's on the outgoing tide when the water's pooling off the flat and the water starts getting really slick and low, right? So when that water starts coming up, we can kind of scan the area and see a lot more in a incoming peak, basically high tide. So now that we've talked a little bit more about incoming tide, let's talk a little bit about the outgoing tide. So outgoing tide simply is just water flooding away and retreating back till we get to our lowest point, which would be low tide. So there's a lot of things that we can do during low tide. Most people think of low tide as not fishable, or there's stipulations that we can't really even be out there because the boat's going to get stuck. So obviously tides can help us, get away from problems where, we're not getting stuck, but it could also help us discover where the fish go at the end of an outgoing tide. So when we are thinking of the needle in a haystack theory, when you throw that needle in a haystack, it is very hard to find the needle. So low tide kind of makes it a little bit easier. When all that water retreats off the flats, it comes out of the mangroves, it's got to pile up somewhere. It tends to pile up in channels, potholes on the flats, little dark, deep crevices around those islands out there in the bay. Basically any deep form of water that's near the flooded out draining water. They kind of have to pool together. So all those redfish that were on the flats during that top of the incoming that we were talking about have to go somewhere. And a lot of times that somewhere is places like the channels. So what does that do for us? All of a sudden that needle in the haystack becomes a lot easier to find. I find it a great time to throw little jig heads into the channel with a nice little paddle tail and just pop it off the bottom. 9 times out of 10, we are getting some action because we have better odds. These fish are stacked up together in the channels and they're more condensed, and I find that it increases our chances of getting a fish to commit, right? So that's a little bit of some of the stuff we could do during our low tides. So let's talk a little bit more about predictability with these tides. So unlike weather, like wind, rain, that stuff is very volatile and hard to predict. Tides, especially here on the east coast of Florida, are very predictable. So if you're like myself, that we need to carve out 3 hours fishing time before we have a responsibility that we need to get to, it's very useful to use these tides to predict trips weeks in advance. So if 4 weeks from now on a Saturday you want to go fishing, might as well use the tides to find your picture perfect, best possible conditions to increase your chances of having a good day. So those are one of the things that we can do with tides. We can actually predict the future in terms of what's going to happen. Are we going to be fishing an incoming in the mangroves? Are we going to be doing an outgoing in the channels? What's going to be happening weeks out? We can do that with tides. So now let's go ahead and push into some of the different types of fishing we can do in outgoing and incoming. So for example, if you are doing fishing from shore, if you are one of the guys who likes to hit the bridges, you like to do the jetty fishing for snapper, whatever it might be, a lot of times a later incoming tide, so the top of the incoming tide, is the best route to go, right? You got heavy water movement, the water just flooded up, all these fish are excited, because they're getting into new feeding grounds that they didn't have access to a couple hours ago. So if you're fishing from shore, one of my favorite things to do is wait for that top of the incoming tide and start fishing those tides. So also, we do have other variables other than the tides. Those other variables are like wind. So if we have 15-mile-per-hour winds, we might see a 6-inch difference than what it's showing on our tide charts. So the tide charts are great to tell us timing, but a lot of times, depending on other variables, mostly wind, it can be a little bit different. So that's why it's really important to, use these tide charts as a general gauge of what is to come, right? Because there's a lot of outlying variables that can make it not so perfect that it looks like on the screen. So now that we got that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about these little red items that we see here. So basically, these little red divots or pockets are below the threshold. So that's water lower than the threshold. Not every tide table is going to see this, especially in some of these more predictable areas. So I wanted you guys to see that. So when you do see a tide chart with this negative red, that's basically meaning very low tide. Simply put, it's a very low tide. It's below the threshold. So we're going to go ahead and flip over to this GPS map screen. And I kind of just want you guys to visualize what we're talking about here. So if we are looking at this part of a tide right here that we were speaking about earlier, this is the top of the incoming. So this is the high tide right here. This right here would be the peak high tide. So this little sliver of space, let's call it from right here to right about here, is my favorite time to be hitting the mangroves. That is because we are still getting water movement pushing up on these shorelines. You're not getting that slack, flat tide right here where the water's not moving. You're getting the benefits of water pushing into the mangroves while still getting some movement and some current to flush baits in and out. So typically in an incoming tide, what we're doing is basically just cruising these mangroves and trying to flip at here and see if there's any redfish, snook, tarpon, whatever it might be that's kind of pushed in to the mangrove, sea trout, whatever it is. These points can be really hot, especially when they create little side rips where they're kind of protected from the water that's been flushing in, and you kind of get a steady current moving from right to left, left to right, and you get these little dull and empty pockets where they're kind of still and kind of slicked out. Those are really interesting areas. Remember, fish are very lazy animals. When you have a slack tide, it's not because the fish are just not hungry. They just don't want to exert energy. So the whole reason us fishermen look at the tides is because it tells us when fish are most likely going to bite. Fish are opportunistic eaters. So you're more likely to see a fish explode on your plug when you're flipping into the mangroves when there's a current and when water's moving. That's why this right here is such a great time to hit those mangroves, this little piece of that tide right here. So when I say fish are lazy, basically they're just very opportunistic and they like the current and the water movement to set them up for success where they don't have to exert more energy than they have to. So think about, snook posted behind pylons, or deep in the mangroves, just kind of waiting there and letting the current do the work for them. Put that crab, pilchard, whatever it is, right there in their face to make it easy. So when the slack tide comes around, it's not that they're not hungry. I'm sure they're starving. It's just they're not willing to do any additional work than they have to burn those extra calories or extra energy. So we're going to talk a little bit also about the importance of the actual tide from a time point to a next time point, and how that affects the speed in which the water moves. So right here would be a cookie cutter perfect tide because of this nice steep curvy line. This gives us an indication the steeper the line is, the faster that water is moving up or down. So the faster the water is moving up, the faster the water is moving down, it indicates that more bait is going to be pushed, more fish are going to be feeding. We really do like those fast currents when we're out there fishing because it means action and life, right? it's not always this way. Sometimes we'll get, let's say, a low tide, so right here a peak low tide at, let's call it 6 in the morning, and it'll be very horizontal line, something like this, to go all the way across to, let's call it, a peak high tide at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's a long tide up. So when you see, you know, your friends say, oh, the tides are horrible today, chances are what they're talking about is you have a tide that is very long and drawn out, and the water's moving very slowly up. Us fishermen, what we're looking for are those nice curvy lines and those quick tide changes that kind of give a very rapid movement of water. So we're going from, let's call it a 6 a.m. low to, you know, to a 12 in the afternoon or 11 a.m. high. So that's a fast tide where it's pushing tremendous amounts of water, and that in turn is tremendous amounts of bait, predators, eating, and life, right? So that's one of the things to look out for when you're fishing. Anything that seems like a long, drawn out line, and it's taking a longer time to go from low to peak high, peak low to peak high, that will tend to be a little bit worse off of a day, you know, in a picture perfect world, right? Just because the tides are bad doesn't mean you're not going to catch fish. It's just not ideal for what we're looking for. So a little bit more about slack tide. Slack tide is basically on the chart anything that's kind of usually over the peak. I've learned that slack tide could be anywhere from somewhere around here all the way to like kind of right around here, or a little bit more up. Actually, I would say like the top part of the peak right here is probably slack, and then same thing at the bottoms. So what can we do during outgoing tide? You probably want to position yourself to be fishing somewhere at this part right here where we're still able to get close to the mangroves, but the water's definitely come down a little bit. So let's say we're fishing right around here. You want to position yourself where you're somewhere around here in the time frame of the outgoing tide, and probably position yourself close to these little channels like this. If it was an outgoing tide and I'm fishing this channel right here, I would probably want to be somewhere close to the corner or close to the edge right here at the peak where I'm still catching these fish. I'm putting myself between the fish that are coming out of the mangroves and where their destination is, these deeper channels, right? So when we're all the way at the bottom of this tide, let's call it right here, dead low tide, I probably want to position myself dead smack in this channel. Or I might even want to push in a little bit further to the deepest parts of these channels. You know, let's call it one of these big bays right here. During a high tide, you know, all of this might be covered. So when it is peak high tide, all this might be covered, and you would have to explore all of this whole entire area. Needle in the haystack theory tells us when it's low tide, everything that was swimming here, that's all mud now. It's all channeled out into these little, you know, streams and estuaries and this big river in the middle. So where we want to focus during these peak, you know, low tides, like right around here and basically anywhere in this red, we want to put ourselves dead smack center here. Start casting, make some cast here, pop off the bottom. Chances are there's a lot of redfish, snook, tarpon bottled up in here and condensed. So using these tides, we can better predict where the fish might be, and we could also predict where we want to place ourselves to be between the fish. So in summary, what we're looking at, this tide chart is able to tell us where we are in terms of a high tide, where the water's up, and where we are in terms of a low tide. It's up to us to decide where we put ourselves and to learn how the fish move during these tides. So that pretty much wraps it up, guys. If you have any questions, anything I briefly went over but didn't dive deep enough into, let me know, leave a comment below. If I don't know the answer, I'll look it up and get back to you. If you guys want a one-on-one where we could go more in depth into this kind of stuff, I could go into personal experiences and we can kind of microanalyze the situation. Email me on the attached email for the YouTube channel. Go ahead and direct message me and we'll schedule something out. Thank you guys. Please make sure to subscribe and have a great day. Thank you.